The cruelty of Trump's government was only matched by its incompetence, a purge that erased 40% of America's intelligence overnight. Inside Congress, Jasmine Crockett slams out a black box, and the chamber gasps as the words "neutralize dissent" flash across the screen in blood-red letters. Trump explodes, hurling slurs and screaming "fake," while his Republican allies descend into chaos, spitting insults that shake the walls of power. The nation watches in horror as the mask of patriotism rips away to reveal a mafia state. But here's the question: when Jasmine dares to expose the ugliest truth of all, will America stand with her, or crumble under its own silence? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber had barely caught its breath when another voice sliced through the storm, measured, icy, stripped of passion. Tulsi Gabbard rose, her expression carved in stone, her tone as cold as the steel in a guillotine. "We are cleansing factions," she declared, her words delivered like a verdict, not an argument. "This is not destruction, it is discipline. America cannot stand with disloyalty in its own house." The phrase hung in the air, chilling precisely because it was so calm, so deliberate. No shrieking, no fist-pounding, just the flat conviction of someone defending an execution as if it were housekeeping. The chamber stilled, stunned by the audacity. Jasmine tilted her head, a sharp laugh cutting into the silence, though there was nothing humorous in it. Her voice dripped with scorn. "Cleansing," she echoed, each syllable dragged like a blade. "You call destruction a shower. You cut 40% of our intelligence overnight. You strip clearances from men and women whose only crime was telling the truth. You didn't cleanse, Tulsi, you sterilized the truth itself." Gasps broke across the chamber like glass shattering. Even some of Tulsi's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Tulsi did not blink, her arms folded, her posture unyielding, as if she welcomed the weight of outrage. Jasmine slammed her palm onto the mountain of papers still bleeding from the black box. The sound cracked across the microphones. "How many families have been gutted by your so-called cleansing? How many careers shattered, pensions stolen, reputations burned, because you and your president cannot stand to face reality? Do you know what it feels like for a father to tell his daughter he can't come home because his clearance was revoked for telling the truth?" Tulsi's jaw tightened, but her mask remained. "Collateral," she said quietly. "Necessary collateral," the chamber gasped again. The word was a dagger plunged not into Jasmine, but into every American watching at home who at once believed loyalty could protect them. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her voice darkening with fury. "Collateral? That's what you call patriots whose only sin was honesty. That's what you call democracy's guardians when you line them up and cut them down. Collateral?" She spit the word like venom, her gaze pinning Tulsi to her chair. Trump shifted in his seat, lips curling back into a satisfied smirk as if Tulsi had struck the blow he could not deliver. But Jasmine turned toward him, her voice rising above the chaos. "Do you see what your empire calls justice, Mr. President? Families destroyed, experts silenced, patriots branded as waste. You turned a government into a firing squad and called it reform." The gallery above erupted boos, cheers. The sound of a country divided, a democracy cracking open on live television. The chair's gavel thundered against the desk, his voice nearly breaking. "Order. Order in the chamber." But there was no order left. Only fury, only fear, only the sharp edges of truth colliding with power. And through the chaos, Jasmine's final words of the exchange cut deeper than any gavel could strike. "Call it cleansing if you want. America knows the truth. What you've done is not purification, it's execution." And the nation was left to choke on the question, when power calls repression reform, who will expose the lie? The chamber had barely steadied itself after Tulsi's chilling words when Jim Jordan leapt up like a man possessed, his face crimson, his fists clutching a thick folder stuffed to bursting. He stormed toward the microphone, waving the papers above his head as though they were holy scripture, veins bulging against his temples. "This," he shouted, voice cracking with theatrical rage, "this is the proof that Crockett and her allies don't want you to see collusion, sabotage, betrayal. Every page is evidence that our government was infected with traitors." He slammed the folder onto the desk, scattering sheets across the wood like the feathers of a slaughter bird. The camera zoomed in, capturing flashes of bold headlines, shaky signatures, and grainy photographs, all designed to scream guilt without ever proving a thing. Jordan jabbed his finger at the pile, his voice a crescendo of false certainty. Here it is. The betrayal, the corruption, the rot in our institutions. This is what Jasmine defends. The room rumbled with gasps, some lawmakers nodding, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For a moment, it seemed his fury had cracked the chamber wide open. But then Jasmine rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her expression somewhere between disdain and amusement. She reached across the desk, plucked one page from the mess, and held it up to the light so the cameras and the millions watching at home could see the smudged ink bleeding through cheap paper. Her smile was razor thin, her words laced with acid. "You brought fiction," she said, her tone slow, deliberate, dripping with contempt. To a fact-finding hearing, the chamber froze, the insult detonating louder than Jordan's folder ever could. She dropped the page back onto the pile, like someone tossing aside trash. "This isn't evidence, this is theater. You printed lies on paper, stapled them together, and hoped no one would notice the stench of propaganda." A roar surged from the Democrats' side, clapping and shouting, while Republicans slammed their desks in fury. The chair's gavel hammered down in vain, his voice nearly breaking under the useless cry of "Order, order." But the noise was unstoppable, a storm swallowing the chamber whole. Jordan's face twisted, his jaw grinding, his voice climbing into a shriek. "How dare you dismiss this evidence? These are sworn documents." Jasmine leaned forward, her tone cutting deeper, her eyes locked onto his like a hawk circling prey. "Sworn by whom? Congressman? A printer in a propaganda factory? A ghostwriter? In your party's echo chamber? If this is your truth, then God help America, because you've traded integrity for cheap theater tickets." Trump shifted in his chair, his mouth twitching into a grin at Jordan's desperation, but Jasmine's gaze swung to him with lethal precision. "Is this what your presidency is now, Mr. President? Paper lies passed off as justice, while real patriots are silenced. If this is your defense, then America isn't just under attack, it's already hostage." The roar inside the chamber fused with the chants from outside, the sound a tidal wave pounding against the walls. "Truth, truth, truth." Jasmine stood unmoved, her figure carved in steel against the chaos, and as the pages fluttered uselessly across the desk, America was left asking itself, can truth survive when propaganda floods the room? The ink from Jordan's fake pages was still fluttering to the ground when Marjorie Taylor Greene shot up like a lightning strike, her face flushed crimson, her voice tearing through the microphones with a pitch that made the air itself vibrate. "Traitor! Liar! Witch!" she shrieked, pounding her fists against the desk like a zealot summoning chaos. Her hair whipped loose from its pins, her eyes wild with fury as she leaned into the mic, spit flecking the glass. "You're nothing but a disgrace, a puppet, a whore for Soros." The chamber convulsed. Republicans banged their fists in rhythm with her shouts, amplifying the madness into a drumbeat of rage. Democrats shouted back, the sound colliding into a storm so fierce the chair's desperate gattling sounded like a child tapping on wood. Cameras zoomed in on Greene's face, distorted with fury, veins standing out on her neck as she screamed like a banshee unleashed. But Jasmine didn't recoil. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and let a smile curl across her lips, slow, deliberate, lethal. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but every word landed like a scalpel slicing clean. Terrets scream when Nastors pull the strings, the line cut deeper than any insult Greene could conjure. The chamber froze for half a second, then erupted again, Democrats howling with laughter and pounding the desks, Republicans shouting in blind rage, the crowd outside roaring so loudly it seemed the walls themselves shook. Greene's face drained of color before it flushed even darker, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came. For the first time in the entire hearing, she had been stripped bare, exposed not as a fighter, but as a puppet. Trump slammed his hand on the desk, his voice cracking with fury. "Don't you dare talk to her that way. You're finished, Crockett." But the words sounded hollow, overshadowed by the chants from outside. "Truth, truth, truth." The chant grew louder, carried on television screens into living rooms, bars, and classrooms across America. Millions watched as one congresswoman stood like iron, while her enemies shrieked themselves hoarse. Jasmine rose to her feet, the black box still glowing like a threat between her hands. She turned her gaze from Trump back to Greene, her voice now rising above the chaos with a clarity that carved through the storm. "You can scream all you want, you can hurl insults until your throat bleeds, But screaming doesn't make truth disappear, it only proves how terrified you are of it. The roar peaked, the chamber convulsing under the weight of clashing voices. The chair's gavel cracked against the desk until the wood splintered, but still no order came. The noise wasn't just volume anymore, it was violence, words weaponized into an assault on democracy itself. And as Jasmine stood unshaken in the maelstrom, her eyes blazing with fire, the question seared itself into every heart watching. At what point does noise become violence against democracy? The chamber quaked with fury, but it was nothing compared to the eruption that followed. Trump slammed both fists onto the desk, the sound reverberating like a cannon blast through every microphone, shaking the very air in the chamber. Papers flew, pens scatter, aides recoiled as his voice, hoarse and raw, exploded across the hall. "I'll crush every traitor, every damn one of you. You think you can embarrass me on live television? You'll regret it, you'll all regret it." The camera zoomed in mercilessly, capturing the veins bulging across his temples, his face blotched crimson, spit spraying from his lips. For the first time, his carefully crafted mask of swagger had torn open, revealing a man unhinged, cornered, seething with a rage so primal it bordered on fear. The audience watching at home sat in stunned silence, transfixed by the image of a president unraveling in real time. Across from him, Jasmine didn't retreat. She rose slowly, her movements measured, deliberate, like a predator stepping into the ring of a wounded beast. The chaos around her seemed to dissolve, the screaming, the pounding desks, the chair's gavel lost in futility, all of it fading into the electric focus of two figures locked in combat. She walked toward Trump, her heels striking the marble floor with the finality of a drumbeat. Trump jabbed a trembling finger at her, his voice cracking under the weight of fury. "You're nothing, a nobody. You have no power here, Crockett." She stopped just inches from him, close enough that her voice could drop to a whisper sharp enough to slice through the storm. Her eyes locked onto his, unblinking, merciless. "Then why does truth from a nobody make the President of the United States shake like a coward?" Gasps ripped through the chamber. Lawmakers clutched their desks, the gallery above leaned forward in disbelief. Even the Republicans, once shouting, faltered into an easy silence. For a fleeting second, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the ragged heave of Trump's breathing, the sweat dripping down his temples. His lips trembled, his jaw clenched, but no words came. The cameras caught every twitch, every flicker of panic in his eyes. And in that moment, America didn't see strength, it didn't see control. It saw a man cracking under the weight of truth, a man exposed. Jasmine leaned in, her voice just loud enough for the microphones to capture, her tone cold, surgical. "You're not trembling because of me, Mr. President. You're trembling because for the first time in your reign of fear, the truth isn't running, it's staring you dead in the eye." The eruption that followed was volcanic chants of truth, truth, pounding against the chamber walls, fists slamming desks, the sound of a nation teetering between collapse and catharsis. Trump collapsed back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests like lifelines, his chest heaving, his fury impotent. And across America, millions of viewers sat frozen, their hearts pounding with one chilling thought. What happens when a president cracks under the weight of truth? Trump's roar was still echoing when Tulsi Gabbard stood, calm, collected, her face unreadable, her voice a contrast to the frenzy that had just torn through the chamber. She didn't shout, she didn't slam the desk. She simply adjusted her jacket and spoke into the microphone with a chilling composure. "This is national security," she said, each word deliberate, slow, like the swing of an executioner's blade. "We acted to protect this country, to neutralize internal threats before they endangered our people." For a moment, the chaos softened. Her words were like ice thrown onto fire, and the room absorbed them with a stunned unease. Some Republicans nodded firmly, their faces grim with manufactured resolve. Others glanced nervously at the cameras, at the millions watching. Tulsi's voice was calm, but the weight it carried was suffocating. Jasmine tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as if she were examining not a colleague, but a mask carved too perfectly to be human. Then she laughed, not loud, not mocking, but sharp, cutting. She stepped forward, her voice rising with each syllable, contempt dripping like acid. "National security," she spat. "No, this is not security. This is a gag order in a flag's costume. You dressed up repression as patriotism and expected America to salute." Gasps cut through the chamber, sharp as shrapnel. Half the room erupted in applause, fists pounding desks, while the other half shouted curses, red-faced, veins bulging. The split was surgical, half the chamber roaring for Jasmine, the other half raging for Tulsi. The chair's gavel cracked. Down again, his voice pleading. Order, order. But there was no order. Only war. Tulsi's eyes narrowed, her voice steady but strained. You think you know what it takes to protect this nation? You think you understand the threats we face? Jasmine's reply was instant, her tone colder than steel. Yes, I understand. The threat isn't foreign. It's sitting in this room, hiding behind flags and slogans, while silencing the very people sworn to defend us. She slammed her fist onto the pile of crimson-stamped files, the sound like a gunshot. You called patriots traitors, you erased truth and called it reform. You weaponized loyalty to protect one man's power. Don't you dare rap at In the Stars and Stripes. The chamber convulsed. Protesters outside screamed so loud it shook the glass. Truth, truth, truth. Inside, lawmakers shouted over one another, spittle flying, arms flailing. Some wept, others cheered. And in the middle of it all, Jasmine stood unflinching, her hand pressed against the evidence like it was America's last heartbeat. Trump leaned back, grinning now, savoring Tulsi's deflection. But the cameras didn't linger on him, they lingered on Jasmine, her face carved in fire, her voice slicing through the uproar one final time. Wrap your lies in the flag if you want, but remember this, even the strongest fabric burns when truth sets it alight, and America was left trembling with one thought. How many lies can be wrapped in a flag before it burns? The chamber was already a battlefield of voices when Marjorie Taylor Greene suddenly bolted upright, her body trembling with rage, her fingers stabbing the air like a weapon. Her voice shredded through the microphones, sharp and furious. You snake, she screeched, her words bouncing off the marble walls, dripping with venom. That's all you are. Crockett, a snake slithering in here pretending to be righteous. The room roared, Republicans pounding their desks, echoing her insult like a war chant. The gallery above shook with no's, the crowd outside surged, louder. The word snake hissed and howled like a chorus designed to drown a single voice. But Jasmine did not flinch. She didn't even blink. Slowly, she turned her head, fixing Greene with a stare so unrelenting it cut through the cacophony. Then she spoke, calm but searing, her voice amplified by the silence that seemed to follow. Snakes don't pretend to be doves, she said, her tone like ice melting into steel. Snakes are honest about their venom. It's you who cloaks poison in feathers, screaming patriotism while feeding on fear. The insult landed like a hammer blow. The chamber gasped. Democrats slamming desks in triumph, Republicans shouting themselves hoarse in fury. Greene's face twisted, her mouth opening, but nothing coherent came out, just guttural sounds drowned by laughter and shouts. The camera zoomed in mercilessly, capturing her humiliation, her eyes darting, her composure shredded before a nation. Trump slammed his fist against the desk, trying to redirect the storm, but even his outburst was lost in the tidal wave of sound. Outside, the crowd thundered louder. Truth, truth, truth. Their voices became the rhythm of the nation's heartbeat, echoing into every living room, every bar, every phone screen across America. Jasmine stepped forward, the black box still under her hand like a loaded gun waiting to fire. She locked her gaze on Greene again, her words slicing through the storm. You can call me a snake, you can call me a traitor, you can scream until your throat rips. But remember this, truth cuts deeper than venom, and the deeper it cuts, the more it exposes what you've been hiding. The chamber convulsed, some shouted her down, others rose to their feet in applause, while the chair's gavel pounded desperately, his voice shredded into uselessness. Greene collapsed back into her chair, her face pale, her body shaking, her mouth forming curses. She could no longer scream. She had struck first, but Jasmine had drawn blood. Trump glared across the table, his eyes burning with hatred, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to snap. But Jasmine didn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She stood tall, her hand pressed firmly on the evidence, her eyes blazing into the cameras as though speaking to every American watching. And in that moment, one chilling truth seared into the nation's conscience. What if defending truth makes you the villain in their story? The chamber was still quaking from Greene's humiliation when Jim Jordan shot to his feet again, his face flushed with rage, his tie hanging crooked, his fist clutching the desk like he wanted to tear it apart. His voice tore through the microphones. "Ryan, unrestrained. Mr. Chairman, I demand immediate censure of Congresswoman Crockett. She has insulted the president. She has undermined our national security. She has brought shame into this chamber. She must be punished now." His words detonated like dynamite. One by one, GOP lawmakers surged to their feet, pounding desks, shouting in unison like a mob that had rehearsed its outrage. "Censure! Censure! Censure!" The chant rose, thunderous, drowning the desperate pounding of the chair's gavel. The air vibrated with fury, the sound of a lynch mob disguised in suits and ties. Cameras swung to capture the spectacle. Elected officials transformed into a frenzy, their faces twisted, veins bulging, their voices unhinged. Some Democrats shouted, "Back," others slammed fists in protest, but their voices were swallowed in the storm. The chamber no longer sounded like Congress, it sounded like an arena, a crowd baying for blood. The gallery above leaned forward in horror, protesters outside screamed louder to match the chaos inside, and millions of Americans at home sat, frozen, watching their government unravel live. And in the middle of the storm, Jasmine Crockett did not move. She did not shout back. She did not flinch. She did not so much as blink. She stood at her desk, spine straight, her hands resting on the mountain of evidence, her eyes locked forward with a gaze of iron. The cameras found her face and lingered there, capturing the stillness of a single woman against the convulsions of a mob. Jordan leaned over the microphone again, his voice cracking under the strain of fury. "If she is not silenced today, then every word she utters will be an act of treason. Do you hear me? Treason." He slammed his hand against the desk so hard the veins in his arm seemed ready to burst. Republicans roared their approval, their fists beating the desks like war drums, their chants shaking the walls. "Traitor! Traitor! Traitor!" The chair pounded the gavel, his voice hoarse, pleading, "Order! Order! This is a chamber of law." But no one listened. The rule of law had been drowned by the roar of rage. Jasmine raised her chin, her lips curling into the faintest trace of a smile. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It carried sharp and clear, slicing through the chaos like lightning through a storm. "You can chant censure until your throats collapse, you can scream treason until the walls fall, but this nation knows the truth. Mobs don't defend democracy, they bury it." The room shook, some roaring in approval, others screaming in fury, but no one could deny the image burned into the screens of America. A single congresswoman standing against the mob, unshaken, immovable, her eyes unblinking steel, and the question carved itself into the soul of a divided nation. When the mob rises inside Congress, who stands their ground? The mob inside the chamber was still roaring when the heavy wooden doors creaked open. For a split second, the chaos faltered, as if the sound of hinges slicing through the storm carried its own command. Heads turned, cameras swiveled, and into the battlefield of Congress stepped a figure no one expected. Joel Willett, former CIA officer, his stride calm but deliberate, his jaw set with the gravity of a man who had carried secrets too long. In his right hand, small but glinting under the lights, was a single black USB drive. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some Republicans froze mid-chant, recognition flashing across their faces. A few Democrats rose instinctively, sensing that history itself had just walked through the door. The chair, his gavel still trembling in his hand, blinked in disbelief. "Mr. Willett, you're not." Joel's voice cut through, low but unshakable. "I was silenced, my clearance stripped, my name erased. All because I dared to say one thing. That national security cannot serve one man's paranoia." The gallery above erupted in whispers, reporters nearly falling over themselves to catch every word. Jordan snapped around, pointing at him with the desperation of a cornered animal. "This is a stunt. He doesn't belong here. Remove him at once." But Joel only raised the USB higher, his hand steady as stone. "Inside this drive is the paper trail, the emails, the orders, the blacklists. Proof that what Congresswoman Crockett exposed today is not theory, it's fact." A silence crashed down on the room, sudden and suffocating, broken only by the whir of cameras zooming in on the tiny piece of plastic that now seemed heavier than the Capitol dome itself. Jasmine locked eyes with Willett, her lips tightening. In a grim nod, he had been one of the voices she suspected existed, one of the names buried under the rubble of firings. And now he was here, resurrected in real time before a stunned nation. MTG shrieked from her seat, her voice cracking with panic. "Traitor! You're a traitor to your oath." Joel turned his gaze on her, cold and unflinching. "My oath was to the Constitution. You and your masters betrayed it the day you turned security into a weapon of fear." The gallery thundered with gasps and murmurs. For the first time, Green faltered, shrinking under the weight of a man who had lived in shadows darker than she could imagine. The chair struggled to restore order, but it was too late. The entire chamber had shifted. The mob had been silenced not by force, but by revelation. Joel stepped forward, placing the USD gently onto the witness table, his hand lingering on it for a moment before he spoke again, softer this time but no less searing. "The truth doesn't vanish because you revoke a badge. It waits, and now, it's here." The cameras cut between Jasmine's steady eyes, Joel's unyielding stance, and the pale faces of Republicans who suddenly looked less like hunters and more like prey. And the question now loomed over every beating heart in the chamber. Can one whistleblower flip the entire script? The monitors flicker, the chamber holding its breath as the contents of Joel Willett's US became alive. For a heartbeat, nothing but static, then a single phrase appeared on every glowing screen. Neutralized dissent. The letters were sharp, blood red, pulsing as if they carried the rhythm of a nation's buried heartbeat. 10 seconds. That was all it took. 10 seconds of silence so heavy it felt like the walls themselves were suffocating. Lawmakers froze in their seats, the gallery leaned forward in stunned disbelief, and even the air seemed to pause, unwilling to move. It was the silence of a courtroom before the guilty verdict. The silence before a bomb detonates, and then chaos. Reporters screamed questions, cameras exploded in flashes, the chamber cracked into hysteria. Trump slammed his fist against the desk, his face purple with fury. "Fake, fake. This is all fake." His roar echoed off marble, a beast cornered by the very words he had long used as weapons. Jasmine shot to her feet, her voice slicing through the storm like a blade. "Fake is your coward's mask. Fake is the curtain you hide behind when truth sets the room on fire." Her words detonated like a second explosion. Democrats thundered in applause, pounding the tables. Republicans shouted over them, desperate, flailing, some calling for security to cut the fee, others chanting lies, lies. But the image remained, unwavering on every screen, the words burning deeper with each passing second. Neutralized dissent. Jordan leapt forward, his papers rattling in his hands. "This is Doctor, a fabrication planted by enemies." Joel Willett didn't flinch. "These are your government's own directives. Coded, signed, executed, not by enemies but by yourselves." His tone was calm, merciless, a surgeon peeling back diseased flesh. The gallery erupted again, a raw wave of gasps and curses. MTG shrieked, pointing at Jasmine with a trembling hand. "You're working with them. You're the traitor." Jasmine cut her off, her voice laced with venomous clarity. "If exposing betrayal makes me a traitor, then history will crown traitors as patriots, and cowards as the villains they always were." The chair pounded the gavel, screaming order, order, but no one listened. The chamber was no longer a hearing room, it was a crucible, and the fire had consumed its walls. The cameras broadcast every second to a nation glued to their screens. A country realizing that this was not politics as usual. This was survival. This was raw exposed. This was America staring into its own abyss. Trump, red-faced, stumbled for words, but his voice cracked, trembling beneath the weight of the evidence, now seared into every mind. Jasmine leaned forward, her tone lowering, her eyes locked on him like a predator closing in. "The question isn't whether this is fake. The question is how many Americans will refuse to be silenced when the truth screams louder than your lies." The chamber erupted once more, but this time it wasn't chaos, it was judgment. And in that instant, America felt the scales tipping, because when evidence screams louder than lies, the only question left is, will America finally listen? The chamber's lights dimmed slightly as Jasmine Crockett rose, a crimson folder clutched in her hand. Without a word, she crossed the floor and slammed it open across the projector. In a single motion, the wall behind her lit up, not with vague rhetoric, not with speculation but with a timeline bathed in red. Dates, names, departments, each mark was a scar. Each entry, a body buried under clearance revoked. Gasps broke the silence. The words glared like open wounds. Election Security Division purged, cyber defense analysts removed, intelligence officers terminated, A jagged red line slashed downward across the years, like the slow bleed of democracy itself, and at the bottom, the final number, 40%. 40% of America's guardians of truth wiped out in less than 2 years. Jasmine's voice was low, steady, but every syllable cut like broken glass. 40%, not incompetence, not accident. This was deliberate. They weren't just employees, they were the firewall between America and manipulation. She stabbed her finger toward the glowing red chart. And that firewall has been burned down from the inside. The chamber convulsed. Some Republicans shouted denials, their voices shrill, desperate. Democrats pounded the tables, demanding answers. Reporters scrambled, phones raised, the timeline flashing across screens. Nationwide, the gallery, packed with citizens and families of those fired, erupted into a chorus of sobs and rage. One woman screamed, "That's my son's name." Her voice pierced the chamber like a blade, and for a moment, even the lawmakers fell silent. Trump leaned forward, his face twisted, sweat glistening under the lights. "This is fiction, a smear, a con job by the radical left." His words stumbled, crack, drowning under the weight of the evidence still glowing behind him. Jasmine turned slowly, her eyes locked on him. "Then explain why your own signatures seal every dismissal order. Explain why election experts were the first to be silenced. Explain why dissent is now firing offense." The tension snapped like a cable under pressure. Jordan leapt to his feet, waving papers, shouting, "Objection! This is distortion." That the projector betrayed him. One of the red entries read Jordan memo cosign. The chamber recoiled. The air sucked out of the room. Cameras zoomed, his face exposed under the merciless light of his own complicity. Jasmine stepped closer to the red timeline, her hand hovering over the screen, as if presenting the body of democracy on an autopsy table. Her tone hardened. "This isn't a government protecting its people. This is a syndicate protecting its boss, a mafia dressed in stars and stripes." The words landed like thunder, each syllable sparking in the chamber's electric air. The audience erupted against some chanting shame. Shame, others roaring in defense. The gavel pounded, useless against the rising storm. Jasmine raised her voice one last time, sharp, unyielding. "The question is no longer how much power they've taken. The question is how close can a democracy come to a mafia before it stops being a democracy at all." And with that, the red timeline glowed brighter, like a warning flare shot into the heart of America. The chamber was already a furnace after the red timeline. But the moment Marjorie Taylor Greene rose, it became an inferno. Her face flushed crimson, eyes wide with manic fire. She snatched the microphone from its stand and hurled it onto the desk. The metallic clang echoed like a gunshot. Then came the scream, "Traitor!" Her voice cracked with venom, every syllable spat like shrapnel aimed at Jasmine. Gasps rippled across the room. Some clutched their seats, others raised their phones to capture the chaos. The word traitor hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, suffocating, inescapable. Jasmine did not flinch. She rose slowly, deliberately, the way a soldier would in the face of fire. She turned her gaze on MTG, calm, cold, surgical. And then, in a voice low yet sharp enough to slice the silence, she answered, "If truth is treason, then you've buried America alive." The chamber shook. Applause erupted from one half of the room, a wave of thunder rolling across the floor. Fists pounded tables. Chants of USA, USA, collided with shouts of liar, fraud. The sound was no longer political debate, it was war cries echoing off marble walls. MTG, unhinged, pointed a trembling finger. "You're siding with enemies of the state." Her voice was shrill, desperate, as if shouting loud enough might drown out the evidence that had already seared itself into the minds of everyone watching. Jasmine stepped forward, her eyes never leaving MTG's, enemies of the state. She shot back, "Know what you fear are enemies of your lies. You scream traitor because you've run out of arguments. You scream because the truth finally speaks louder than your nose." The audience roared. Some Republicans stormed out, their chairs clattering against the floor. Others hurled insults across the aisle. But the cameras caught what mattered. MTG, red-faced and shaking, silenced not by force, but by a single sentence that turned her weapon into her own wound. For a brief second, the chaos paused. Reporters scribbled furiously, viewers at home leaned closer to their screens. And in that fragile silence, Jasmine's words landed again, heavier this time, as if carved into the air. "If defending my country makes me your traitor, then I will wear that name until the last breath leaves my body." The chamber detonated. Standing ovations clashed with furious boos, the sound a storm that no gavel could tame. The chair pounded the desk, shouting order, order, but order had already died. What lived now was revelation, raw and violent. Jasmine did not move. She stood in the storm she had summoned, her figure steady against the maelstrom, like a lone tiller holding back the collapse. Her face was unshaken, her voice unbroken, her defiance a beacon and a dare, and the question that thundered beyond the chamber, carried into every living room across America, was this: what if defending your country means being branded a traitor? Will you still stand, or will you bow to the mob? The chamber had already been ripped open by screams and accusations, but when Donald Trump slammed both palms on the table, the very walls seemed to tremble. His voice, guttural and raw, tore through the air. "The people chose me." The words rolled like cannon fire, daring anyone to deny him. For a moment, the room froze. His loyalists nodded in unison, pounding the desks, chanting his name as if invoking an unbreakable spell. Camera zoomed in, catching the vein bulging at his temple, the sweat shining on his forehead. His claim wasn't just a defense, it was a crown he demanded everyone polish. With silence, Jasmine didn't grant him that silence. She rose, slow but steady, like a shadow lengthening over fire. Her eyes cut into him, her lips curled with contempt. And then, with the precision of a dagger aimed at the jugular, she answered, "They didn't choose your stupidity as policy." The chamber gasped as if the oxygen had been ripped out. Some laughed in disbelief, others shouted in outrage, but everyone knew what had just happened. Jasmine had stripped his throne bare with 10 words. Trump's face twisted, rage carving deeper lines into his already storm-worn features. "You dare," he began, but his words were drowned out by a new sound. From outside the chamber came a roar. At first it was faint, like distant thunder. Then it grew, wave after wave, until the marble floors vibrated under its weight. Protesters, crowds, the anger of thousands rising like a tide, spilling chants through the windows. "Liar, traitor, justice." The fury of the streets merged with the tension of the chamber, and for a moment it felt as if the entire capital was under siege from its own people. Inside, the split widened. Republicans shouted for order, Democrats pounded the tables for truth, while the chair's gavel cracked in futility. Yet through it all, Jasmine stood tall, her voice carrying above the chaos. "You claim the people chose you," she said, stepping closer until the distance between her and Trump was no more than a breath. "But the people didn't choose to be betrayed. They didn't choose corruption, lies, or fear as their daily bread. You wear their trust like a mask, and when it slips, what's left is nothing but a coward's face." Trump staggered back half a step, as if the words themselves had weight. His hands tightened into fists, but no retort came. The chants from outside bled into the room, louder, harsher, undeniable. His shield, the illusion of unanimous support, was cracking in real time, live on every screen in America. And then Jasmine delivered the final blow, her voice as sharp as a verdict. "When the leader betrays trust, who speaks for the people? I do. And no threat, no mob, no tyrant will silence that truth." The chamber erupted. Cameras shook as shouts collided with thunderous applause. Trump's defiance had met its counterweight, not in force, but in truth spoken without fear. And, for the first time that night, the question was no longer whether Trump still held power, it was whether America would finally reclaim it. The chamber still trembled with the echo of Trump's last roar, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She rose slowly, the silence parting before her like a tide before a storm. The cameras swung toward her, lenses trembling as though they knew they were about to capture something history would never let go of. Her gaze didn't turn to her enemies, nor to the allies who sat in awe. She looked straight into the camera, past the wires, past the lights, past the screens, straight into the living rooms and kitchens of millions of Americans holding their breath. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel, striking the heart of the nation. "Justice is not for sale. And neither are we." For a moment, time fractured, some wept, some clenched fists. Even those who despised her felt the sting of the word searing through the air like fire across dry grass. The declaration wasn't just against Trump, it was against the rot that had been sold as patriotism, against the silence that had been dressed up as loyalty. The chamber shifted, then easily. A few stood in applause, others muttered curses under their breath, but it no longer mattered. The fight had spilled beyond the marble walls of Congress. It had entered every home, every street, every heart. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes narrowing with the precision of a blade. The question is no longer what he will do. The question is, what will you do? The words reverberated like a challenge hurled into the soul of the nation. A long pause followed, deliberate, almost unbearable. The silence was not empty, it was a demand, a mirror, a verdict waiting for an answer. And then, she gave the final cut, sharp and irrevocable. Will you stay silent, or will you stand with truth? The screen went black, the heartbeat returned. 1 thud, 2 thuds, 3, and then nothing. Only the weight of her words remained, echoing into the void, daring America to choose. Across the nation, screens glowed with Jasmine's words, burning themselves into the memory of a country on edge. In a dimly lit bar in Ohio, a row of veterans, scarred, stoic, men who had seen war sat frozen. One clenched his whiskey glass so tightly it shattered in his hand, blood mixing with liquor, but he didn't look away. Another whispered through clenched teeth, "That's the oath we swore to." In a cramped student dorm in California, dozens huddled together around a laptop, terror-streaked faces painted with frustration and fear. But when Jasmine's challenge, "What will you do?" echoed, they erupted, pounding desks, shouting as though her voice had reached straight into their lungs. One girl raised a rejection letter high, and the others followed, as if daring the world to silence them again. In a quiet living room in Texas, a family sat divided. A father muttered curses at the screen, while his daughter wept openly beside him. The mother, trembling, touched her daughter's shoulder and whispered, "Don't ever be afraid to stand for truth." The tension in that room mirrored the nation's, fractured, raw, yet undeniably awake. Crowds gathered in Times Square, in front of the Capitol, outside county courthouses. Ordinary Americans turned into witnesses of a history that demanded participation. Some raised flags, some fists, some prayers. But in every face, rage, grief, hope, there was one shared realization. Silence was no longer an option, and as the chants grew louder, stand with truth. Stand with truth. The question Jasmine had hurled was no longer hers alone. It was America's. What would you risk to protect democracy? Your comfort, your fear, your silence? The answer would not come tonight, but it would come. And the world was already holding its breath. The broadcast seemed to end, screens dimming into silence. But then one final flicker, a black background. A single file name glowing in harsh white. Oval Office _secret.m for A. Pending. The chamber froze. Living rooms across America froze. A file, locked yet alive, sitting like a ticking bomb in plain sight. And then came the second line, searing red, each letter pulsing as though carved into the nation's conscience. Truth demands witnesses. The words weren't just text. They were an accusation, a summons, a dare. The crowd outside roared in confusion. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up like wildfire. Every senator, every American watching knew something still waited in the shadows of power, something too explosive to vanish quietly. Jasmine's eyes locked on the screen, her breath caught between resolve and dread. She knew what such a file could mean. Confirmation, betrayal, devastation. Across the aisle, Trump's face twitched, a flicker of recognition, or was it fear? He slammed the table, shouting over the nose, but his voice was already drowned beneath a tidal wave of speculation. The camera panned slowly across the chamber, sweat glistening on foreheads, lips bitten raw, hands shaking. The silence was more violent than any shout because everyone understood this wasn't over, not by a mile. This was the kind of secret that could burn through walls, topple pillars, reshape history. And as the screen faded to black, one final line remained, pulsing like a heartbeat. What secrets still hide in the Oval Office? And are you ready to hear them? The question didn't echo in the chamber, it echoed in America. And for the first time, the country realized truth wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding at the door. In every age, power tries to bury the truth under nose, fear, or symbols meant to distract us. But the story reminds us that truth, no matter how dangerous, demands voices willing to defend it. Silence is not neutrality, it is surrender. And courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Justice is never handed down, it is fought for, word by word, stand by stand. When history knocks on your door, Will you stay silent or will you rise and answer with courage? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. The room still pulsed with the echo of chants from outside, but Jasmine stepped forward, steady, unflinching, carrying a single sheet of paper that seemed heavier than steel. She held it high, and the camera zoomed in. An emergency petition. 3 words cut across the top like lightning etched in ink. Freeze clearance cuts. Appoint special prosecutor. Gasps rippled through the chamber. This was no longer a debate. This was an ultimatum. Jasmine's voice rang out, her tone measured yet charged with urgency. Every signature here is a stand for truth. Sign, and you side with democracy. Refuse, and you side with its executioner. The air thickened. Even the gavel dared not interrupt. Republicans mutter, their faces twisted in rage. Democrats leaned forward, hearts pounding, as if a guillotine blade hung above their necks. The petition lay between them all, glowing under the lights like an open wound demanding to be touched. Trump's eyes narrowed, his lips curling with disdain. A piece of paper, he spat. That's all you've got? Paper burns. Jasmine turned, her stare cutting through him. So does tyranny. The difference is paper rebuilds nations. Tyranny only buries them. A silence swept the room, suffocating yet electric. Every lawmaker knew what was at stake. Signing wasn't just ink on paper, it was defiance, a public brand of rebellion, one that could end careers or worse. Cameras hovered over each trembling hand, ready to broadcast courage or cowardice to millions of living rooms across America. The first pen clicked. A senator's hand shook as the nib met the line. The chamber gasped as though the earth itself had tilted. A second followed, then a third. Courage began to cascade, each signature hammering against the fortress of fear, but not all moved. Some froze, sweat dripping, torn between survival and duty. Trump's glare bore down on them like a predator scenting weakness. Think carefully, he hissed. This is treason. Jasmine raised the petition higher, her voice defiant. Treason isn't defending your people, it's betraying them for power. Treason is silencing truth, purging expertise, weaponizing fear. If you fear his shadow more than you love your country, then history will tch your name in shame. The chamber erupted into shouts, accusations, applause, curses. The divide had never been sharper, never more exposed. Tens scratched across paper like drumbeats of a new rebellion, each signature a match struck in the dark. Outside, the roar of the crowd swelled as word spread. Congress was signing. Protesters surged, their chants no longer just rage but a strange, rising hope. And Jasmine, with the petition still clutched in her hand, delivered the final line not as a plea, but as a verdict. Who dares sign when truth has a price? Only those who deserve to be called leaders. The rest will be remembered as cowards who watched democracy burn. The chamber stood at the cliff's edge, and America held its breath. The chamber felt like it was tilting, as if gravity itself had shifted. One by one, lawmakers rose from their seats, hands trembling, faces pale but resolute. Each step toward the petition echoed like thunder across marble floors. The pen scratched, leaving streaks of black ink that glimmer under the relentless lights, marks that no history book would ever erase. The GOP erupted in fury. Traitors, they screamed, pounding their fists on the desks, their voices cracking into raw hysteria. Yet their rage sounded less like power and more like desperation. The panicked howls of those watching control slipped through their fingers. Outside, the sound hit like a tidal wave. Tens of thousands pressed against barricades, fists raised high, their voices fusing into one primal demand. Sign IT, sign IT. The chant shook the windows, rattled the microphones, drowned out the chaos inside. It wasn't just noise, it was a summons, a command from the people themselves. A young representative, visibly shaking, glanced toward the gallery where veterans, mothers, and students sat with eyes burning. She stepped forward, gripped the pen, and signed. The crowd outside exploded as if the earth itself cracked open. Another lawmaker followed, then another. The hesitation in the room began to crumble, replaced by something far more contagious than fear. Courage. Jasmine stood motionless at the center, eyes like steel, watching the ripple grow. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she simply held the petition steady, like a torch. And one by one, lawmakers reached for that flame. The chamber transformed from a battlefield of insults to a forge of defiance, each signature hammering. Against the chains of silence, Trump's face twisted in disbelief, his fists clenching until knuckles whitened. He spat venom across the microphone. "This will not save you." But his words were swallowed by the roar outside, a roar too vast, too relentless, to be silenced by one man's threat stopped by the time the 50th pen struck paper. The GOP's shouts were nothing more than static against the deafening wave of hope. For the first time in years, democracy didn't feel like an institution, it felt alive, breathing, fighting back, and Jasmine, voice low yet unyielding, sealed the moment with a single line: "Fear divides, but courage spreads like fire." The chamber froze, the streets erupted, and America realized the spark had already become a blaze. Trump's roar shook the chamber like a siren tearing through bone. His fists slammed the table, papers flying into the air like fragments of a dying empire. Veins bulged across his neck, spit sprayed across the microphone, and his voice cracked into something animal. "I will bury you all." The words didn't sound like policy, they sounded like a curse, like the last incantation of a man watching his throne turn to dust beneath him. Gasps rippled across the room. Some clutched their chests, others froze as though the very air had turned toxic. For a split second, it felt as if the chamber itself tilted into darkness, gravity yanking everyone toward the abyss Trump was screaming into. And then, cutting through the madness, Jasmine's voice landed like a blade of ice. "The only grave here is for your lies." The room fell into a silence so sharp it stunned. No rebuttal, no chant. Just the hollow echo of his rage dying against the steel of her words. His eyes darted wildly, searching for allies, but every face seemed farther away. Every shout of loyalty swallowed by the weight of the truth pressing in. The lights flickered, the screens froze, and then blackout. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only one sound remained: the thundering drum of a heartbeat, loud, uneven, suffocating. Was it Trump's? Was it America's? Or was it the pulse of history itself? The beat grew louder, faster, relentless. Every thud was a reminder that the world was still watching, breath held, waiting for the verdict of this moment. In the dark, Trump's silhouette convulsed, his voice breaking into a hoarse growl. No longer words, just noise, pure, frantic, meaningless noise. And then Jasmine's outline emerged in the gloom, calm, steady, unshaken. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was more damning than any speech, more final than any gavel. When the screens flared back to life, they caught a single image: Trump slumped in shadow, consumed by his own fury, while Jasmine stood like a sentinel, unbroken. And in that instant, America knew the roar was over. The truth had survived. What remains after the noise, Jasmine whispered into the silence, is not fear. It's judgment. The chamber froze, the heartbeat faded, and the curtain of history slammed shut with a single, resounding silence. The chamber still trembled with the echo of Trump's last roar, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She rose slowly, the silence parting before her like a tide before a storm. The cameras swung toward her, lenses trembling as though they knew they were about to capture something history would never let go of. Her gaze didn't turn to her enemies, nor to the allies who sat in awe. She looked straight into the camera, past the wires, past the lights, past the screens, straight into the living rooms and kitchens of millions of Americans holding their breath. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel, striking the heart of the nation. Justice is not for sale. And neither are we. For a moment, time fractured, some wept, some clenched fists. Even those who despised her felt the sting of the word searing through the air like fire across dry grass. The declaration wasn't just against Trump, it was against the rot that had been sold as patriotism, against the silence that had been dressed up as loyalty. The chamber shifted uneasily. A few stood in applause, others muttered curses under their breath, but it no longer mattered. The fight had spilled beyond the marble walls of Congress. It had entered every home, every street, every heart. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes narrowing with the precision of a blade. The question is no longer what he will do. The question is, what will you do? The words reverberated like a challenge hurled into the soul of the nation. A long pause followed, deliberate, almost unbearable. The silence was not empty, it was a demand, a mirror, a verdict waiting for an answer. And then, she gave the final cut, sharp and irrevocable. Will you stay silent, or will you stand with truth? The screen went black, the heartbeat returned 1 thud, 2 thuds, 3 and then nothing. Only the weight of her words remained, echoing into the void, daring America to choose. Across the nation, screens glowed with Jasmine's words, burning themselves into the memory of a country on edge. In a dimly lit bar in Ohio, a row of veterans scarred, stoic, men who had seen war sat frozen. One clenched his whiskey glass so tightly it shattered in his hand, blood mixing with liquor, but he didn't look away. Another whispered through clenched teeth, "That's the oath we swore to." In a cramped student dorm in California, dozens huddled together around a laptop, tear-streaked faces painted with frustration and fear. But when Jasmine's challenge, "What will you do?" echoed, they erupted, pounding desks, shouting as though her voice had reached straight into their lungs. One girl raised a rejection letter high, and the others followed, as if daring the world to silence them again. In a quiet living room in Texas, a family sat divided. A father muttered curses at the screen, while his daughter wept openly beside him. The mother, trembling, touched her daughter's shoulder and whispered, "Don't ever be afraid to stand for truth." The tension in that room mirrored the nation's, fractured, raw, yet undeniably awake. Crowds gathered in Times Square, in front of the Capitol, outside county courthouses. Ordinary Americans turned into witnesses of a history that demanded participation. Some raised flags, some fists, some prayers. But in every face rage, grief, hope, there was one shared realization. Silence was no longer an option, and as the chants grew louder, stand with truth. Stand with truth. The question Jasmine had hurled was no longer hers alone. It was America's. What would you risk to protect democracy? Your comfort, your fear, your silence? The answer would not come tonight, but it would come. And the world was already holding its breath. The broadcast seemed to end, screens dimming into silence. But then one final flicker, a black background. A single file name glowing in harsh white. Oval Office _secret.m for a. Pending. The chamber froze, living rooms across America froze. A file, locked yet alive, sitting like a ticking bomb in plain sight. And then came the second line, searing red, each letter pulsing as though carved into the nation's conscience. Truth demands witnesses. The words weren't just text. They were an accusation, a summons, a dare. The crowd outside roared in confusion. Reporters scrambled. Phones lit up like wildfire. Every senator, every American watching knew something still waited in the shadows of power, something too explosive to vanish quietly. Jasmine's eyes locked on the screen, her breath caught between resolve and dread. She knew what such a file could mean. Confirmation, betrayal, devastation. Across the aisle, Trump's face twitched, a flicker of recognition, or was it fear? He slammed the table, shouting over the nose, but his voice was already drowned beneath a tidal wave of speculation. The camera panned slowly across the chamber, sweat glistening on foreheads, lips bitten raw, hands shaking. The silence was more violent than any shout because everyone understood this wasn't over, not by a mile. This was the kind of secret that could burn through walls, topple pillars, reshape history. And as the screen faded to black, one final line remained, pulsing like a heartbeat. What secrets still hide in the Oval Office? And are you ready to hear them? The question didn't echo in the chamber, it echoed in America. And for the first time, the country realized truth wasn't knocking anymore. It was pounding at the door. In every age, power tries to bury the truth under noise, fear, or symbols meant to distract us. But the story reminds us that truth, no matter how dangerous, demands voices willing to defend it. Silence is not neutrality, it is surrender. And courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Justice is never handed down, it is fought for, word by word, stand by stand. When history knocks on your door, will you stay silent or will you rise and answer with courage? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.